Well, we made it to the final lesson of chapter 11, and I think you're going to like this one. We're going to look at pedigrees, which is another type of visual aid that can be used to predict and also look at patterns of inheritance in a family, as well as predict possible future generations of offspring for a certain trait. If and when you have kids, you might meet with a genetic counselor, and they will actually sketch out a pedigree asking you about certain traits, specifically diseases that could be in your family, and then what the risk is that your children might have that as well. But we're not going to be tracing any diseases today. We're going to be looking at some other non-disease related traits in humans. But first, let's learn about what a pedigree is, how to interpret this diagram by looking at the one shown here. So this is a very simple pedigree, just showing two generations in a family. The father on the left, shown in the square, that's always going to be the pattern or the symbol for a male is a square. And the female is going to be a circle. So we have a father and a mother, and the marriage line is the horizontal line that connects them. The line that drops down vertically between the marriage line represents their children, and they go in order from left to right, would be the oldest to youngest. So their first child was a boy, then they had a girl, then another boy, and then another girl. Okay, so this is a family of 6. 2 girls, 2 boys to the 2 parents shown above. Now, in terms of what it's showing for the inheritance of a trait, we don't know what the trait is, but people that have the box or circle shaded in would be affected by that trait. They express the phenotype for that trait. So, according to this pedigree, only the mother has that trait. So now we're going to do a practice problem, a little more complicated, with 3 generations in a family, with the youngest 2 being these 2 sisters here, one who has a widow's peak and one who does not have a widow's peak. If you recall, widow's peak is a dominant trait. So we're going to be basically solving the pedigree to figure out what are the genotypes of all of the individuals in this family tree, if possible. There will be some scenarios where you might not be able to determine the actual genotype, but we're going to try that and at least narrow it down to what they could be. So I like to start with the one that there could only be one possible genotype, and that would be having no widow's peak, because if widow's peak is the dominant trait, that could be capital W, let's say capital W, or capital W lowercase w. They could be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. But somebody who doesn't have a widow's peak could only be little w, little w. So any individual that is not shaded in does not have the widow's peak and would be little w, or whatever letter you decided to pick. Just make sure that they're both lowercase to show that they're recessive. Okay, now where to start? I usually start at the top left and work down with the grandparents. So we have on the left, the shaded in would be the grandfather on their father's side, and he has widow's peak. So he's either going to be big W, or big W, little w. How would you figure out which one it is? Well, interestingly, their wife has no widow's peak. This is actually a scenario where you could do a test cross. So remember that we talked about a test cross when we were learning about Mendelian genetics, and you would take the dominant phenotype that you don't know the genotype, and you cross it with the homozygous recessive individual. And then you look at the offspring to determine what the genotype of the parent was. So you would go ahead here and you could do 2 Punnett squares. One would be big W by little w, and the other would be big W by little w. The good news here is that they have 4 kids, 2 of whom you already know the genotypes that are little w. So they would have to get one of each of their alleles from each parent, which means that the grandfather has to be heterozygous. It's the only thing they could be in order for their 2 kids that are no widow's peak to have the 2 recessive alleles. So that's a method that you might have to apply as you work through these pedigree problems. However, sometimes you still can't tell. If they don't have kids, you might not be able to determine which of the dominant genotypes they are. So when we encounter one of those, we can talk about that. But go ahead and see if you can solve the rest of the pedigree based on what we just discussed. And I would say pause it now. I'm going to go through the answer if you're still working. So maybe you can give it a try before we go over it. Okay, we're going to go over the pedigree now. So this is the fully solved pedigree. And as you can see, the other grandparent, the grandmother on their mother's side, was basically the same scenario as the grandfather. You could have used a test cross if you couldn't see it easily to determine that they would be heterozygous. And then likewise, those in the next generation, the let's see, the aunt on the father's side, the father and the mother would all be heterozygous, and that's because one of the sisters has no widow's peak. So they all have to carry, well, at least their parents carry the recessive allele to give to the sister with no widow's peak, but also the dominant allele, at least one would need to be for the sister with the widow's peak. So when we get to her, this is the point where we can't tell because she doesn't have any children of her own. So we're going to just have to leave it with it could be homozygous, dominant, or heterozygous for widow's peak. All right, let's try another one. In this one, by the way, we were tracking a dominant trait, widow's peak. So all the shaded individuals had the dominant trait, but you could also use a pedigree to track a recessive trait like attached earlobes versus the free earlobes. So it's the same process as before, except the shaded in individuals are going to be the ones that you might want to fill in first, as I did here, little f, because that's the recessive genotype, and that's the only genotype that those individuals with attached earlobes could have. So go ahead and take a few minutes to solve the rest of the pedigree to see if you can figure out all the missing genotypes for the rest of the family who has the not attached but free earlobes. And I would pause it now if you want to give yourself a chance to do that before I go over it. All right, I'm going to reveal the correct answer now to the pedigree. We'll go one generation at a time, starting with the top. So all of the grandparents would be heterozygous for their free earlobes. And that's because if you look at their offspring, if any of their kids have recessive, two lowercase f's, then they would have to be heterozygous parents. One of the parents would have to be heterozygous in order to give their children the recessive allele. So in the first scenario, it's a monohybrid cross because both parents are heterozygous. In the second set of grandparents, one is recessive and one is heterozygous. So these are different than the first one we looked at with the widow's peak. Now, once you have the genotypes of the grandparents, you could do Punnett squares for each of these to see what the genotypes of the offspring are going to be. So in the first one, the monohybrid cross, well, it's interesting because you will get all three of the genotypes, big F, big F, big F, and little f, little f. For their oldest daughter, which would be one of the aunts of the two girls, the two sisters, she doesn't have any kids of her own. So we can't determine if she's going to be homozygous dominant or heterozygous. So we're just going to say that it could be either or. But the father, who's also a child of the same set of grandparents, we know that he's going to be heterozygous because one of the sisters has the free earlobes. I'm sorry, the attached earlobes, lowercase f, lowercase f. And we already knew that the mother, same thing, had to be heterozygous because of the Punnett square of her parents. There would be no way she could be big F because she has to get a little f from her father and either big F or little f from their mother, but to be dominant, they have to have one dominant allele. So that would have to be their mother's genotype. So now that we have the genotypes of the sisters' parents and they're both heterozygous, that's another monohybrid cross. So what did you get for the sister with the free earlobes. Well, again, it's a scenario where we can't say 100% if she's dominant homozygous or heterozygous. We'd have to wait and see if she has a family of her own to know whether or not she is one or the other of those genotypes.